Hi, we enter into the first of their stories in chapter 20 that begins the section that we're going to explore in Genesis 20 to 22. If you haven't yet watched the introductory video, which I posted just before this one, I strongly encourage you to do so because there are many issues as we enter into this section that would be helpful to understand before we enter into any given passage. And I'm going to assume that viewers that watch this and the following videos have watched the introduction. So if you find yourself a little bit confused, I hope that going back to the introduction will take care of any confusions that may result from incomplete information in this video by itself. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, I have up the traditional placing of the three so-called wife-sister stories. And as I was noting last time, in older scholarship, this was understood as three stories from three different sources expressing one event from three different perspectives. But more recently, scholarship has rejected that notion and has read this more as part of the continuous narrative in which we find it in Genesis. And that's what we're going to do here as we get into chapter 20. You can see I've color-coded the parts that are similar across them, and it's really important that we recognize as we begin this what parts of chapter 20 scene assumes that we know chapter 12 and which parts do not. When we get to chapter 26, we'll see that 26 is actually closer to 12 in some ways than 20 is. So when we were, and I'll make this a little bigger so you can see this part without worrying about whether you can see the part on chapter 26. So you can see that when we were back in chapter 12, the narrator told us a couple of things that were going on before the actual encounter between the local king, in this case Pharaoh, and Abraham or Sarai. So first there's a famine in the land, and so the immediate situation is the need for food. And it's following up on the scene of Abram's call. And so it's there in that context expressing the contrast between Abram's obedience with no questions to the call to leave your land and your family, and now what he's going to do when there's food. And then we're told, similar to ours, he went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, and we'll hear it here, residing in Gerar as an alien. One of the big differences we'll see momentarily is the narrative context of this, because here it'll follow right after we heard Lot residing in Sodom as an alien, but we'll come back to that in just a minute. We also heard all this part that's in bright pink here that we don't hear in our section, where Abram tells Sarai, "You are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his woman,' and they will kill me." Later in Abraham's discussion with Abimelech, he'll say something somewhat similar, but he doesn't say it to Sarah, and we don't hear the reported speech. So already in this one, we knew there's a famine, and he tells her to say, "You're my sister," because he's afraid that the Egyptians will kill him to get to her. But here in our story, once we hear that he resides as an alien, we see immediately Abraham said of his woman, Sarah, "She is my sister." And it comes completely out of nowhere. We don't know who it's being said to or where they are at all. They're in Gerar, but who he's talking to or what the immediate situation is, we don't know. And there's no sense of why he's in Gerar residing as an alien, especially since it said he just settled between Kadesh and Shur. So those are some of the differences that we see right at the beginning. And we're only going to go through verse 7 today. So some of these other differences we can look at, including the reward in blue here when we get to that part. We also noted last time, and I just want to highlight this again, that this is the first scene in a whole set of scenes in these chapters. And as I was noting last time, they can seem like they're just a series of random passages that don't seem to fit together unless we look carefully at how tightly they are connected. And so I just want to review a little bit of that so we can be aware of that as we enter the details of the story. First, seeing how this passage fits into this whole unit here, we can see this chiasm of the two chapters of Genesis 20 and 21, where it's framed by the scenes with Abimelech, which answers some of the question of why is this scene right here that seems to come out of nowhere? Why are they discussing a well and making a covenant there when everything else was about children being born and the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, or at least the conflict between Sarah and Abraham around Ishmael and Isaac. And then, as Wenham notes, our immediate chapter here forms at least a loose chiasm, and I'll put Wenham's version of it up here in a five-part chiasm, five-level chiasm here, so 9 parts, and you can see that for yourself. It's not completely a tight chiasm. We can see that Abram settling in Gerar is not really parallel to Abraham praying for Abimelech in his house, but there certainly are elements here that are parallel, highlighting the completion of this unit as a unit as we have it. And that's important because some scholars have argued that the last 4 verses, 15 to 18, were additions from a different source, and when we get there, we'll look at that. But an element I didn't look at last time was the specific connections between what went before the Sodom story and our story here. So let's look at some of those connections we can see right here. And so right away, we're told that Abraham, in this case, residing in Gerar, is an alien exactly as Lot was, and that is against him, according to the people of Sodom, that he came as an alien and he's trying to judge them. There's explicit or implicit incest here between Lot's daughters and their father, and between Abraham and Sarah as brother and sister, at least half brother and sister. It's still incest. The question from Abimelech here, but from Abraham back in chapter 18 about destroying an innocent people. The threat of divine violence against the visitors, against Sarah here, and against the angelic visitors in chapter 19. Divine protection that prevents the sexual violence. In chapter 19, it was the angels pulling the visitors, or pulling pulling the door closed, and then blinding the Sodomites, so Lot's family would be protected. And then here we're told that God protected Abimelech from touching Sarah, and a divine threat to destroy the entire place or people in both cases, and then a reference to rising early, which we'll get to next time, and we'll have a chart about rising early. There aren't that many times. So plainly, we're reading this as a continuation of the scene that went before. And to continue that, we note this starts here from there. And Green notes below that this seems superfluous, maintains the anonymity of that location. But I'd read it differently, because plainly the previous scene is Lot and his daughters in the cave, and that's Green's point. But earlier, we'd seen Abraham standing on the hill watching the smoking ruins of Sodom, and it's from there that he's journeying. And plainly, what it's doing is it's drawing us back to where Abraham was in the previous scene that was interrupted by Lot and his daughters. So we're continuing where Abraham was. From here, journeying through the region of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. Let's look at the atlas a little bit to get some idea, although it's confusing, because Negev simply means south. So he's traveling through the south, and south is all relative. If the Sodom area, which we don't know for sure it is possibly, as this map shows, somewhere over here. Here's where Zoar is, the little town that Lot went into. Perhaps it's over there. Then it's southward this way, but it's really not clear. And settled between Kadesh and Shur, and here's the wilderness of Shur. Here's Kadesh Barnea here, and yet we're told that he's residing in Gerar, which is here. And Gerar is plainly a Philistine town, and the Philistines are not mentioned now, but in chapter 26, Abimelech will be associated with the Philistines. And so that's just one of the many ways that this section and the Abraham story is connected with the David story, and we'll look more at that, especially when we get to chapter 22, because David spent some time in Gerar with King Achish of the Philistines back in 1 Samuel. But that's not what's happening here. So whether he had settled, which really implies putting your tent stakes down and being in one place for a while, and yet residing in Gerar. And so all we know, he's residing there, and then he says randomly, she is my sister, presumably to anybody who asks. And just a reminder, if you're not familiar, the Hebrew doesn't have a word for wife here, so really it's just my woman. She is my sister. And now we hear the introduction of King Abimelech of Gerar. So apparently he heard she is my sister, although there's no direct communication here between Abraham and Abimelech. He's apparently just hearing what Abraham is saying. And we'll be told way later in the chapter, although as readers we don't know it now, and that's part of the suspense, that Abraham has told Sarah, wherever we go, say, you're my sister. But we don't know that yet. And again, suspense is part of what makes this story interesting. We'll look at the relative knowledge in just a few minutes. So King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. And the emphasis on took, and it's repeated here, calls us back to 1 Samuel 8. And I want to say call back because that's certainly the older text than Genesis. Whether we take the Genesis text as coming out of exile, or as I was suggesting later, based on Mark Brett's work and others, perhaps even from the Persian period post-exile, which the Ishmael Hagar expulsion story fits so well from Ezra 10 that we looked at last time. So it shouldn't surprise us that kings do what we're told kings do. They take. In this case, taking this man's sister as he understands her to be at this point in the story. But God came to Abimelech in a dream. And this is Elohim here. And that's what led some scholars to see this as an E story. But we're not going to be worrying about that because we're going to see that it's going to be tightly connected, however the parts came to be. So we're not going to try to parse where the source was for this story. And when it comes to a dream, we can look at dreams in Genesis, and this is the first one. God has certainly come to Abram when he was Abram in the darkness we saw in chapter 15, and has spoken to him a number of times, but this is the first time it's a dream. And we see there's a number of dreams of that people experience of God in Genesis. This is the first one, though, and it's not of a person who becomes part of the people of Yahweh, as Jacob plainly is, but neither is Laban, and neither is Pharaoh. And so dreams come independently of whether somebody is loyal to Yahweh or Elohim or not. And Pharaoh's dreams, of course, have nothing directly to do with Yahweh. And of course, people dream whether they're Yahwists or Elohists or not, either way. So, but this is the first of those dreams. And what it partly does is it gives us as readers and Abimelech knowledge that others don't have. And I just want to put this up at the beginning to highlight this, because as our story starts to unfold, one of the key elements is who knows what. And Abimelech knows things that Abraham doesn't know, and that's going to be key. So I won't go over this in detail. I'll refer back to it as we see the events in the story unfold. But key, again, to the story is that knowledge is not distributed equally. And of course, that's part of what happens in ordinary life, but it's also part of what happens in empire when kings have special sources of knowledge. In this case, it's not special reports from his spies. It's a direct experience of God. So that's a little different way that knowledge comes to him there. So let's continue with our story. So God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, or in the night, suggesting that's every night, and said to him, "You are about to die." It's the repeated verb here. You are surely going to die here because of the woman you have taken. Notice that she's not named here. She's not named as Abraham's woman. She's not named as Sarah. She's just named in this abstract way. As Westerman notes, primarily an offense against private property, but as Sarna adds here, Israelite law regards adultery as an offense against divinely given standards of morality, and not merely as a violation of the husband propriety rights. And although Abimelech sees it here as a property issue, the Genesis audience would not. And we'll see that will come up again as we go. So she is a married woman, and Beulath here, and that's the only time in Genesis of a Baal, literally means a ruled over lord, highlighting in the language the patriarchal nature of marriage outside the garden. Remember, back in the garden, they were one flesh, and now it's subject to patriarchy. So Abimelech is told by God she's a married woman, and that's a shock to him because he had been told she was a sister. So now he has new knowledge that he didn't have before. And so now we hear the first part of Abimelech's defense, and as many scholars have noted, he starts off with as we hear from the note down below, so chases the conversation about chastity that honor accrues to Abraham when he is brought into the relationship of king and God in the role of a ritualistic mediator. And so this is the first part here where he goes into the self-defense, but we'll see after this he goes into more immediate questions. So Abimelech, we have to decide whether he's a hero of the story or a victim or something more complicated than that. So he had not approached her. And notice this is the narrator telling this to us. This is not God telling this to anybody else. This is knowledge that we are being given separate from the conversation between them. And we're trusting our narrator here that Abimelech had in fact not approached her, or literally had not drawn near her. And so that's going to be crucial dynamics that we know that no matter what Abimelech says to Abraham, which will suggest something otherwise for reasons that we'll have to explore, that in fact he has not had sex with Sarah. So he says to God, Lord, and it's interesting that he attributes the voice that he hears from to some kind of divine voice. Notice that the voice did not identify itself to him. He just hears this voice, you are going to die because of the woman you've taken, and he assumes it's a divine voice. As Westerman notes, the question as to which God does not arise, but it will arise, not in Abimelech's mind, but it will arise in the reader's mind, as we'll see. And he asks this question, will you destroy an innocent people? And it's not exactly the same, but it's very close, of course, to what Abraham asked about Sodom in the scene that precedes the destruction of Sodom. There, we knew that Abraham was making that argument not just as part of the abstraction of the nature of God's justice, but to try to find a path to get Lot freed from the captivity he'd gotten in from settling in Sodom. And similarly here, Abimelech is asking what sounds like an abstract question for the sake of his own protection and the protection of his own immediate people here. So it really is much more immediately connected here. Literally, will you destroy, will you kill, I'm sorry, the word destroy destroy in the Norse V literally means kill. And innocent here is innocent, Sadiq here, recalling in the same language Abraham's question here. Um, and Abimelech assumes from this that he is innocent, and we were told by the narrator that he had not approached her. So in that sense, he's innocent, but he did take her. So he had taken her, and isn't that as much an offense? So whether he's innocent or not isn't clear, but he's trying to hide behind the whole innocence of his people, as he claims here. But he goes on. He's not done yet. Did he not himself say to me, "She is my sister," which we heard, but we didn't hear this, and she herself said, "He is my brother." And so the only time we hear Sarah speak in this whole chapter is in this indirect speech through the mouth of Abimelech to God. And we don't know that that's true or not. Presumably, Abimelech knows that he's speaking to a voice that will know the truth, but we don't know that. And so we're not sure whether Sarah actually said it or not, although we will hear later that Abraham will tell Abimelech that he told Sarah to say it, but that still doesn't tell us whether she did it or not. And so this could just be something that Abimelech is saying to make himself look more innocent. Notice it also suggests he's heard her speak and gotten close enough to hear her say that. Was he approaching her to have sex with her, and then she said, "He's my brother," which would give him an excuse. That wouldn't prevent him. It would only be if she said, "He's my husband" or "my man," that he would back off. So we just don't know about that. So he says, I did this using two figures of speech, integrity of my heart, Bethem Laveh here, and it's used in the Psalms, but it's also used of David, and it's also used of David and of Solomon here, of David, but imposing it upon Solomon. And so in the chart I showed last time from Megan Warner of all the various connections between the David and Solomon story and the Abraham story, this just adds more detail to that this phrase integrity of heart is connected with David. The second word of the phrase tam here, batam, is used for Noah earlier, for purity or innocence of heart. And the phrase innocence of hands literally means whiteness of palms. So no dirt on the palms. Westerman suggests presupposing the language of a later era, but that's only because he's situating the story in the time period in the story. And we don't need to worry about the anachronism that a story written in the exilic or post-exilic period is not using language that the audience and the authors probably wouldn't know from 1,000 years earlier. So Abimelech, having made his argument that he was completely innocent, then God said to him in the dream. And scholars ask, why then does God have to interrupt again? And why does the narrator have to tell us it's continuing in the dream again? In Roscoff's Freudian interpretation, she calls this the third stage of dream work. Abimelech interprets his own dream, emphasizing his latent guilt with the repeated use of sin and fear in the following verses. So we want to read it in a Freudian way we can, but this is also to highlight that this is still going on in the dream. Yes, I know, God said, that you did this in the integrity of your heart, echoing the same language there. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. And notice this is the first time we're hearing anybody talking about sinning, and it's in fact the first time we're hearing the verb for sin anywhere in the book of Genesis. We heard the noun hatat way early on, way back in the Cain and Abel story. I note, if you haven't followed all the way through Genesis, that contrary to popular misunderstanding, the word sin is never mentioned in the Garden of Eden story. There is no original sin in the garden story. If you want to talk about original sin, it's Cain killing Abel. So we've heard about sin as a noun, but here we hear it as a verb. And God puts it in the form of it was God who kept Abimelech from sinning against God, not against Sarah or Abraham, but against God. And that's why I did not let you touch her. And the word for touch here, again, previously associated with the garden, and where God did allow the woman to touch the fruit, which is interesting there, that God could have prevented it, but didn't stop it there. And we'll see it again around the third wife sister story, around the same situation here as touch. So God has said, you don't need to make a defense here. I already knew it. In fact, I'm the one who protected you from my wrath. And yet that raises the question of then why did God threaten that he would die? And we realize the reason isn't because of a potential sexual sin. The issue is simply that he took Sarah, and that will be the form of restoration that needs to take place here in verse 7, the last verse we'll look at for today. So now then we hear, and as Westerman notes, it's tied to a condition, and this is legal sounding language, as we note here, as my note here shows there's two ways of thinking about the unconditional conduct juxtaposed. The earlier way of thinking, the effects follow even from unintentional behavior, but the later way, that intention is required for there to be guilt. And so we're obviously in that later way of thinking from the exilic and post-exilic period. So now then return the man's woman, for he is a prophet. And that's something new. And the first time we're hearing the word prophet, Nabi, in Genesis, but the first time we're hearing any sense of there's a prophet at all. Westerman claims it's not used in the technical sense, but in a general sense as a man of God. And yet Green disagrees, and I would disagree as well, because it'll be referred to later that Abraham is a prophet based on this. So he's a prophet in that he's in a relationship with God and will speak the truth of God to others. But it's assumed that we know what a prophet is here. It has not a term that's been used before, so readers and listeners have to put their own understanding of that on there. And it's not in the context of monarchy, as we see in the David story, with whether it's Gad, who understands David who's a prophet to David before David's on his throne, or Nathan when David's on his throne. He is a prophet, and he will pray for you. And that's interesting, because that would often be a priestly role, but it's also a prophetic role. Samuel plays that role as well. So he will pray for you and you will live, which raises the question of why that's necessary, given that Elohim has already declared Abimelech innocent, and he knows that he didn't touch her. So if he returns the man's woman, Sarah, of course, then what else is required? Why does Abraham have to pray for you? As if it requires God's further intercession in order to get the outcome that Abimelech wants. So we just don't know there. But it continues, if you do not restore, then know you will surely die, you and all that are yours. And that really raises the interesting question here. It emphasizes the point I was just making, that the threat against Abimelech is not because of the supposed adultery, which both God and Abimelech and Sarah know didn't happen, but because he took her. And if that happens, you and all that are yours would be destroyed. Does that mean just his household, or does that mean the entire city of Gerar? It's quite a threat here from God, and it doesn't fit any theology we've seen in Genesis, that this entire city would be killed for the sin of this one person. In fact, it's almost the exact opposite of what Abraham and Yahweh agreed to in chapter 18, that if there were 10 innocent people, the rest of the city would be saved. Since we know that Abimelech is innocent, it's not clear at all why all this would be killed, even if he's still guilty of keeping Sarah, which he will not be. But there it is. And so we'll have to see in our next scene what happens when Abimelech and Abraham face each other, and the unequal knowledge that we were just seeing plays out in the scene between Abraham and Abimelech. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.